What if the Bible you know is incomplete? Not because of accident, not because of oversight, but because of a deliberate decision made by a small group of men in a specific moment in history to choose which voices would be heard and which ones would be silenced forever. Tonight, we're not talking about conspiracy theories. We're not talking about Hollywood fiction. We're talking about real, physical documents, manuscripts that have been excavated from the Egyptian desert, recovered from monastery libraries, and preserved in museums around the world. Texts that were read by early Christians. Texts that circulated alongside what we now call the New Testament. Texts that were eventually condemned, banned, and in many cases burned. They are called the Apocrypha, and what they contain will change the way you see the story you thought you knew. Before we dive into the texts themselves, we need to understand what we're dealing with. The word apocryphal comes from the Greek word apokryphos, meaning hidden or concealed. These are texts that were excluded from the official biblical canon. But excluded doesn't mean fake. Excluded doesn't mean irrelevant. It means that at a certain point in history, someone made a judgment call. That moment came primarily at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine. For the first time, Christian leaders gathered to decide, officially, politically, and with enormous consequences, which texts would be considered sacred scripture and which would not. The result was the Bible, as most of the Western world knows it today. But here is the question that haunts historians, theologians, and researchers to this day. What was left out, and why? The answer is more complicated and more fascinating than most people are ever told. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer near the town of Nag Hammadi made one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Digging near a cliff, he unearthed a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound manuscripts, written in Coptic, an ancient Egyptian language. They had been buried, scholars believe, around 400 AD, likely hidden to protect them from destruction. Among those manuscripts was the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which tell the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the Gospel of Thomas contains no narrative, no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection account. It is simply a list of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, nothing more. And what sayings they are! The text opens with a remarkable claim. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. This is not the language of mainstream Christianity. This is the language of mysticism, of hidden knowledge, of a spiritual path that runs parallel to, and in some ways directly contradicts, the official doctrine. Among the most debated sayings in the Gospel of Thomas is saying number 77, in which Jesus declares that he is present in the light, in all things, even beneath a stone, even in a piece of split wood. This is not the personal God of traditional Christianity. This is something closer to a cosmic, pantheistic presence, a vision of the divine that would later be called Gnostic. Scholars have fiercely debated the age of the Gospel of Thomas. Some believe it contains sayings that predate the canonical Gospels, traditions that go back to the earliest memories of the historical Jesus. Others believe it was written later, reflecting the theological concerns of a specific community. The debate is not resolved. What is certain? The early church considered it dangerous, and it worked very hard to make sure most people never read it. Perhaps no figure in Christian history has been more distorted, more diminished, and more deliberately misrepresented than Mary Magdalene. For centuries, she was portrayed in mainstream Christianity as a reformed prostitute, a characterization that has no basis in the canonical Gospels and was, in fact, a label applied to her by Pope Gregory I in a sermon delivered in 591 AD. It took the Catholic Church until 1969 to officially correct this misidentification. But there is a tradition, preserved in several apocryphal texts, that paints a radically different portrait of Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in Egypt in the late 19th century and written in Greek, presents her not as a repentant sinner, but as the most spiritually advanced of all the disciples. The one to whom Jesus entrusted his deepest teachings, the one who understood what the others could not. In the text, after the resurrection, Mary shares a vision she has received directly from Jesus, a vision about the nature of the soul, about its journey through realms of power and darkness. The male disciples, led by Peter, refuse to believe her. Andrew openly doubts that Jesus would have shared such knowledge with a woman. Mary weeps, and Levi, another disciple, defends her, saying that if Jesus loved her more than any of them, who are they to reject her? This is not a minor theological footnote. This is a document that preserves what appears to be a real conflict in the early church, a struggle over leadership, authority, gender, and the nature of spiritual knowledge. A struggle that the official version of Christianity resolved in a particular way. A struggle whose losers were erased long before the New Testament, long before the Gospels. There existed a text so strange, so vast, and so influential that it shaped Jewish and early Christian thinking for centuries, and then was systematically removed from the canon and nearly forgotten. The Book of Enoch. Enoch appears in the Book of Genesis, one of the most enigmatic figures in all of Scripture. The text says simply that he walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. No death, no burial. A man who simply disappeared into the divine. The Book of Enoch purports to be his account of what happened next. The text describes, in extraordinary detail, a cosmology of angels and demons, of heavenly realms and divine judgment. It tells the story of the Watchers, a group of angelic beings who descended to earth, took human women as wives, and produced a race of giants known as the Nephilim. This union between the divine and the human corrupted the earth and, according to the text, was the true cause of the Great Flood. This story, this myth of fallen angels, is referenced briefly and cryptically in Genesis 6. The Book of Enoch expands it into an entire theological universe. What makes the Book of Enoch particularly remarkable is its influence. The New Testament text of Jude actually quotes from it directly, one of the clearest pieces of evidence that early Christians treated it as authoritative scripture. Several early church fathers cited it. It was revered, and then it was dropped. Today, the Book of Enoch is considered canonical only in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world. The rest of Christianity left it behind. But the questions it raises never went away. Who were the Watchers? What were the Nephilim? And why did the official canon choose to leave the story incomplete for 2,000 years? One name has been synonymous with betrayal, with cowardice, with evil. Judas Iscariot, the man who handed Jesus over to the authorities for 30 pieces of silver. The man whose kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane became history's most infamous act of treachery. The man who, consumed by guilt, went and hanged himself. This is the Judas that history gave us. But in 2006, a document that had been circulating in the antiquities black market for decades was finally authenticated, translated, and published. The National Geographic Society announced it to the world. It was called the Gospel of Judas, written in Coptic, likely translated from an earlier Greek original. The text presents something that shattered the traditional narrative, a Judas who is not a traitor. A Judas who is, in fact, the most enlightened of all the disciples. A Judas to whom Jesus speaks privately, sharing knowledge he withholds from the others. And a Judas who hands Jesus over not out of greed or cowardice, but because Jesus asked him to. In this version, the betrayal is not a betrayal at all. It is the fulfillment of a sacred mission. Judas does what must be done so that the divine plan can be completed. The implications of this reading are enormous. If Judas acted under Jesus' direct instruction, then the entire moral framework of his condemnation collapses. The villain of the story becomes its most faithful servant. The early church father Irenaeus wrote about a group called the Cainites, a Gnostic sect who reportedly venerated Judas and held a Gospel of Judas in high regard. He condemned them in the 2nd century AD. The text was suppressed. For nearly 1,700 years, it was gone. Now it's back. And the questions it raises have no comfortable answers. Here is where we have to be careful. Here is where the story becomes not just fascinating, but politically charged. The exclusion of these texts was not simply a matter of theological discernment, it was also a matter of power. The early Christian movement was extraordinarily diverse. In its first 3 centuries, there were dozens of competing communities with different understandings of who Jesus was, what he taught, and what salvation meant. There were communities led by women. There were communities that emphasized personal mystical experience over institutional authority. There were communities that believed the physical world was a flawed creation and that the true God existed beyond it. These communities had their own texts, their own gospels, their own traditions. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, this diversity became a problem. An empire needs unity, a single law, a single truth, and so the process of defining orthodoxy, correct belief, accelerated rapidly. Those who held the wrong beliefs were called heretics. Their texts were ordered destroyed. Many were, but not all. Some were buried, hidden in jars in the Egyptian desert, preserved in remote monasteries, copied quietly by scribes who believed the words were too important to lose. What survived tells us something extraordinary, that the Christianity that emerged as the dominant world religion was one version of the story, a powerful version, a carefully constructed version, but not the only version that ever existed. We are not here to tell you what to believe. We are not here to say that the canonical Bible is wrong, or that the apocryphal texts are right. That is a question for theologians, for scholars, for each individual who wrestles with these ancient words. What we are here to say is this: the story is bigger than you were told. There were other voices, there were other visions, there were communities of believers who read different texts, who prayed in different ways, who understood the figure of Jesus through a completely different lens. And those voices, for reasons that had as much to do with politics and power as with spiritual truth, were silenced. The Gospel of Thomas is in a museum in Cairo. The Gospel of Mary is in a museum in Berlin. The Book of Enoch is in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon. The Gospel of Judas is published and available online. These texts exist, they can be read. And what they say is worth thinking about very carefully, because history, as we are constantly reminded, is written by the victors, and the losers, sometimes, leave things behind. If you want to go deeper into the hidden history of early Christianity, the lost Gospels, the erased traditions, the questions that the official record never answered, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we go where the mainstream doesn't.